The Bishop of Charlotte, North Carolina, clamps down on the traditional Latin Mass as the world waits to see what Pope Leo XIV will do on this front. We'll get into that and much more on this edition of the Prayerful Posse. Welcome to this Arroyo Grande series, the Prayerful Posse, where we dive into matters of faith and its impact on the culture. Let's convene the posse. Father Gerald Murray, canon lawyer of the Archdiocese of New York, and Robert Royal, editor-in-chief of the CatholicThing.org. And there's some great columns up there that you should read after you watch this. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Go subscribe to the Arroyo Grande podcast on iHeart, Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube at Arroyo Grande Show, so you don't miss an episode. You don't want to miss the posse. Gents, I have to discuss this, the move to stamp out the Latin Mass by Pope Francis, the popular growth of that Mass, and Bishop Michael Martin of Charlotte, North Carolina, here in the United States. This week he instituted a clampdown on the traditional Latin Mass, even as it has flourished and expanded in his diocese. The bishop is restricting the old Mass, which was in only 4 parishes, to a single parish chapel, 35 miles from the cathedral. He claims he's doing this to promote the concord and unity of the church. Bishop Martin, in a statement, says these updated restrictions are meant to bring the Charlotte Diocese in compliance with Pope Francis's Traditionis Custodes, that motu proprio he signed a few years back. Father, is that explanation valid, especially now since Pope Francis is no longer with us?
Well, it's partially valid because Pope Francis did issue that document which was meant to restrict the Latin Mass, but it also was meant to provide for the pastoral care of those who were still desirous of going to that Mass. So the decision that the Bishop of Charlotte made to restrict it to one location in a chapel, that's not mandated by Traditionis Custodes. Traditionis Custodes certainly doesn't prohibit having multiple places where the Mass can be offered. And he also removed it from parish churches because, yes, Traditionis Custodes said you can't have it in parish churches, but as with everything in canon law, you can ask for a dispensation. And the previous bishop had asked for a dispensation. He decided not to. So there's a lot of his own decision-making here, which is not compelled by Traditionis Custodes, but is rather his decision. And I think it's quite clear he doesn't want the Latin Mass to be generally available and is taking these steps for that reason.
Yeah, we're going to get into some of his other musings and thoughts about liturgy, even the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, and his vision of that. But we'll get to that a bit later. Father, before we go any further, describe quickly what the traditional Latin Mass is, or the Latin Mass that we hear so frequently discussed and that we'll be discussing.
Sure. No, the Mass that most people know, and even non-Catholics visit Catholic churches, it's done in the vernacular. The priest faces toward the people. The readings are in English. Everything essentially is in the vernacular. And the prayers have a more modern flavor. The traditional Latin Mass goes back, in essence, to early centuries of the church. It was codified at the Council of Trent. And it involves, very regulated way of praying. The priest faces toward the altar. The prayers are in Latin. And has a whole different sets of, it's more, we would say, in line with the way the Orthodox celebrate liturgy, which is very specifically regulated. So, yeah, it has a more mystical spirit because, just the way some prayers are said in low voices, some in normal voice. So it's something worth exploring. People who have never been to a traditional Latin Mass, I think, would be very pleasantly surprised to go to one.
Yeah, no, it's filled with mystery. It's like another world in some ways.
Yeah.
Bob, how does cracking down further on a valid form of the ancient Catholic liturgy, how does that promote unity in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, that's the puzzling thing about the argumentation, if we want to call it that. I mean, he does make arguments. Father alluded to some of those.
Yeah.
But how persuasive and how true they are, I find puzzling. I mean, look, this is not a question solely of numbers.
Yeah.
But from what we understand, there were about 1,000 people who would come on an average Sunday to the various parishes or the various churches where the Latin Mass was being offered. There are 500,000 Catholics in the Diocese of Charlotte, North Carolina. And not all of those go to a Mass on a Sunday. Let's say 20% do. So there are 100,000 who show up at Mass, and 1,000 are at a Latin Mass. Now, is that really a large enough number that it's disruptive to the unity of the Diocese of Charlotte? Now, I know very little about it. He is the bishop there. He has the right to run the diocese in certain respects. But it just seems to me that if 1,000 people are setting off or are destroying the unity or threatening the unity of a diocese, well, there's something to be investigated here. There's some power in it that is not simply a matter of people who are schismatic or critical of others. There's some real attraction and power there that maybe shouldn't be stamped out, but it doesn't have to be followed in the way that those people are. If they're troublemakers, you deal with troublemakers, but otherwise, maybe there's something here that can help energize the church, which in many, many parishes is pretty beige, as Bishop Barron calls.
Yeah. Look, I've spoken to a number of priests in that diocese. I know the seminary, which Bishop Michael Jugas kind of expanded, he had more than 40 seminarians, and they were teaching the Tridentine Rite, the Old Mass, in the seminary. So this was a focal point. It was a driving force of vibrancy and enthusiasm throughout the diocese. And the two priests I spoke to said there were many more than 1,000 people celebrating the Old Mass. And some of them had been, it was originally 9 parishes. It went down to 4. Now they're down to 1. It's not a parish. I misspoke. It's a chapel out in the woods, like 35 miles from the cathedral. Starting on July 8th, no parish churches, Father, in the diocese will be permitted to host the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass like it's something filthy and dirty. I mean, Hooters isn't treated like this in this diocese. Bishop Martin notes that his predecessor, Bishop Peter Jugas, requested an extension of the grace period for compliance with Pope Francis's motu proprio that stamped out the old rite. That extension expires this year. He believes the diocese is now ready for the full implementation of the Traditionis norms. On May 27th, the 4 priests of the Charlotte Diocese who pastor TLM parishes, they wrote to their bishop. They wrote to Bishop Martin before he issued this promulgation, asking him to reconsider. Quote, Pope Benedict XVI believed that both liturgical forms could coexist peacefully within the church and even within the same parish. Such has indeed been the case in our parishes since its implementation. Our parishes have experienced harmony with all parishioners, regardless the liturgy being spiritually nourished. The planned removal of the Latin Mass from 4 parishes, affecting over 1,000 parishioners, is a matter of considerable consequence. To remove Catholics with legitimate desires from their own parishes is, we believe, a deeply painful action. End quote. Father, your thoughts on this request of these 4 pastors? This seems to be the experience of a lot of these parishioners, and certainly the pastors and priests I've spoken to.
Yes, I agree with those priests. The assumption that the bishop is enunciating is similar to an assumption that Pope Francis initiated, which is that people who go to the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, are a cause of disunity in the church. And I thought that presumption was not verified in the case of Pope Francis. I think it's not verified in the case of the Diocese of Charlotte. I did visit that diocese once. I went to the seminary. I met the priests in charge. I thought this was an exemplary diocese. No, there's basically a hostility which equates anyone who likes the traditional Latin Mass, rejects the Second Vatican Council, rejects the new Mass, and rejects the life of the Church in general since the Second Vatican Council. And I think that presumption is not true. There are a small minority of people who have a truly schismatic spirit, who like the Latin Mass. They're mostly following Archbishop Lefebvre, but that's not the case of the Latin Mass people who go to the Fraternity of St. Peter and Institute of Christ the King parishes. I think it's just a mistake. And, let's just step back for a minute. We have a crisis of mass attendance in this Catholic Church in the United States. Why in the world would you get angry with people who go to Mass because they like to go to the Mass that their parents went to or their grandparents and say, you're causing disunity? You're not causing disunity. You're upsetting clerics, and, it seems that the bishop falls into that category, who don't have an appreciation for the traditional Latin Mass. So all I would say is, Bishop, listen to your pastors, step back and say, why don't we wait and see what Pope Leo says? Because referring this matter to him would be the most prudent thing in the world.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a moment. And Bob, Father raises an interesting point. If you're saying that people that prefer the old Latin Mass, that they're somehow harboring these deep hatreds of Vatican II or the Pope or division, how do we know people going to the Novus Ordo don't harbor similar thoughts? Or, maybe they think the church should allow the poor to come live in there and we shouldn't have masses anymore. Maybe they want to have clown masses. How do I know what they're thinking? I mean, it is a bit of presumption and, wish casting to kind of imagine that the hearts and souls of people just because of the type of mass they go to. I mean, goodness knows what the Byzantines or the Maronites might be thinking or feeling.
Yeah, I have to say, in fairness, the bishop has said in other places that there are people who abuse the Novus Ordo Mass, but there doesn't seem to be very much strong action to repress that part of what's going on in our liturgies. And you're exactly right. I mean, it was quite interesting that right after Pope Leo was elected and after his inauguration, he met with the representatives of the Eastern churches who were in Rome for the week that was dedicated in the Jubilee for the Eastern churches. And he talked about how important the Eastern churches are to the West, because they have a sense of spirituality and a sense of mystery in their liturgies, and how much they can teach those of us in the West. So just if you're following along, and Leo says Pope Leo says he's following in the line of Francis. Well, if you're following along with that, I think you would want to wait and see how he might want to adjust things a little bit. I go back to the point that, look, if anybody is a troublemaker in a church, of course they have to be dealt with. Yeah. But it doesn't, just because you like the Latin Mass doesn't mean you're a troublemaker. It means you like the Latin Mass. And maybe, in fact, you were more docile to your bishop as a result of your rigid and clericalist impulses. So, look, it's a strange argument that's being made. It's odd that it's being made at this moment. And I think we're going to have to see if Leo is going to take the bull by the horns here and try to set out what I think is a more pastoral and merciful way of dealing with people who were attached to the traditional Latin Mass.
Yeah, those priests, Bob, who wrote that letter begging the bishop to avert course here and not limit the traditional Latin Mass anymore. And what this means, essentially, for those who may not be fully aware, what this means is they're expelling these people from a parish setting, which was set up by Pope Francis. And these priests said, our people feel abused. They feel, marginalized and persecuted here. Father, we've covered Pope Francis's crackdown on the liturgy since it was unleashed. What did you observe in the wake of Benedict's Summorum Pontificum? That gave permission, wide permission, for any priest to offer the traditional Latin Mass. Did you see discord or division in the wake of that, as Pope Francis and Bishop Martin, I assume, now maintain?
No, I saw nothing of the sort. In fact, we have in the Archdiocese of New York, there is quite a bit of interest in the Latin Mass, not only in New York City, but in some of the upper counties, certainly in Westchester County. Yep. So different priests I know would, because of Summorum Pontificum, they began celebrating the traditional Latin Mass in their parishes, and it worked fine. In fact, one priest friend of mine, he inserted that Mass into the middle of the Sunday morning schedule, and people told him, well, this week I'm going to Latin Mass, next week I'll go back to the new Mass. It was just whatever was convenient. And no, it was peaceful and harmonious. And we have to remember, there were two groups that Benedict was concerned about. The people who followed Archbishop Lefebvre. He tried to make a deal with them to restore the society of Pius X. That deal never came about. But the other group were people who remained completely canonically loyal to the Roman See, to the Holy Father, but wanted to go to the Latin Mass in good standing. And Pope Benedict's attitude was, how can I turn a blind eye or a cold shoulder to people who are faithful Catholics? Right. So now let's go back. There's a deeper problem here, and I'd be interested in Bob's opinion on this. But there's the discontinuity and continuity schools of thought that Vatican II was meant to be a discontinuity with the past. So any attachment to anything done before the council is viewed with suspicion by some. Pope Benedict and John Paul II are the other idea. It's all, the faith is from Jesus down to our time. There's a continuity of expression. There are differences, there are improvements, there are mistakes. But we don't say categorically, once a council meets, everything before it doesn't count. And that's unfortunately, I think, what some people are basing their thoughts on.
Well, Bob, as a way to get your opinion on that thought, I'm going to play a little bit. This is an interview I did with Pope Benedict just before he was elected Pope. And well, I'll let you hear what he says here. But he talks about what was true then is true now. Listen to this.
I think it's important to be open to this possibility and to demonstrate so also the continuity of the church. We are today not another church as 500 years ago. It's always the same church and was in one time holy for the church, is always holy for the church, and it's not in another time an impossible thing.
Bob, your reaction to that and this idea that somehow these people are out of the continuity and have no place post-Vatican II.
Yeah, look, the phrase that Benedict invented that I think encapsulates what he was after. I mean, other than the pastoral concern for everybody on all sides of these so-called liturgy wars, the phrase he invented was mutual enrichment.
Yes.
We've got this tremendous 2,000-year cultural, liturgical, spiritual, artistic, literary history in our church. And we have to be in continuity with a church that goes all the way back to Jesus Christ. At Vatican II, there were two dynamics at Vatican II. There was the aggiornamento, the updating, but there also was the ressourcement going back to the church fathers. So the idea that we're somehow in a hermeneutic of rupture, as Benedict called it, that we've broken with the past. And we hear this phrase with some of the people in the Curia these days. We're not going back, they say.
Right.
Well, we don't have to go back, because a tradition is something that is constantly moving forward. It's like being a human person, and you draw on your entire past life with your parents and your schooling and your siblings and whatnot, and all that enables you to go forward. Obviously, there are conflicts and tensions in there, but if you abandon your past, well, then you've got amnesia, or you've got some disconnect with your own humanity. So,
Well, Bob, you're a musician. I always think of this in musical terms. It would be like saying, no more opera and no more Bach. We never want to hear that again. We don't want to hear that Messiah, that Handel guy, too old, out. We only go from 1975 on. That's all we're going to play in this church and here. This is absurd. Why don't you burn down the Vatican museums then? Because all we need is the modern art and the big globe thing in the garden. That's enough. No more of that Pietà. No more of those Greek statues. You don't need that. Father,
Raymond,
you crack at this.
We need the carpenters. We've only just begun. That's the whole theme here.
Exactly. That would be, the carpenters would be an upgrade to some things I've heard in Paris.
That's true. We might have Ozzy Osbourne as the music director at St. Peter's
Yeah, it looks
Basilica.
like an American Idol audition. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but look, what Bob says is eminently reasonable. And the point here is that Pope Benedict didn't say no one can go to the new Mass. It basically said, those people who want to go to the old Mass, let them go. And the priests who want to celebrate it, let them learn Latin, let them learn the rubrics, let them celebrate the old Mass. Now, as in all things, when the people in charge try to restrict a legitimate option, they create a reason which is usually not the case, which is this option's harmful to those who want to use it. Well, wait a minute. Was it harmful at the time the Second Vatican Council was called? Because that's the Mass they all celebrated when they entered into St. Peter's. It wasn't harmful because guess what? It produced people who prayed and decided at the council to make some changes. But hey, the debate continues whether they made a good decision in some of those post-conciliar changes. Let's just keep the debate going.
Yeah. Bob, the obsession that this idea that the TLM community, those who love the Latin Rite, that they were fomenting a movement to deny Vatican II's liturgical reforms, never mind that some of those reforms were never promulgated by Vatican II, that they insist, this is the law. That's not, when you read the documents, they don't call for the version of the Mass we have today in most parishes. They don't. It doesn't look like what they called for. We should recall that back in 2021, when Pope Francis issued Traditionis Custodes, beginning the de facto suppression of the old rite, he often cited the results of a Vatican survey of bishops that he said called for the restrictions he would issue in this document. Here's the quote. This is from Traditionis Custodes. I instructed the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith to circulate a questionnaire to the bishops regarding the implementation of the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum. That was Pope Benedict's permission. The responses reveal, Pope Francis says, a situation that preoccupies and saddens me and persuades me of the need to intervene. An opportunity offered by St. John Paul II and with even greater magnanimity by Benedict XVI, intended to recover the unity of the ecclesial body with diverse liturgical sensibilities, was exploited to widen the gaps, reinforce the divergences, and encourage disagreements that injure the Church, block her path, and expose her to the peril of division, end quote. Bob, there were questions at the time about the validity of those results of that survey, which were never published. Your thoughts on the narrative, though? This is a narrative. It is a characterization of a swath of faithful Catholics that apparently continues.
Look, I've heard that there are stubborn progressives as there are stubborn and rigid traditionalists as well. I mean, this is not something that is unique to one side of the liturgical wars or another. And it's simply, I mean, it's very clear to me that the only way we can approach this at this moment is to do whatever we can to foster people's closeness to Jesus Christ himself. Some are going to find it through one way, some are going to find it through another. I go back and I say, if people are troublemakers, if they're true troublemakers, if there was a parish, for example, or, a group or a cabal within the Diocese of Charlotte, well, certainly they should be told that they have to respect the rights of other people who, I go to a Novus Ordo Mass that has a lot of Latin in it, and I find it quite adequate for most of the time when I go to Mass on a Sunday. But I think that you deal with problematic persons. You don't just declare entire swaths of the Church as somehow illegitimate or a threat, or they're attempting to distort what Catholicism should be in our day. I think we learn from one another, and that's what this mutual enrichment was intended to be.
Yeah, and Father, the Diane Montagna, our pal who was on several weeks ago, she reported at the time that survey did not say what the Vatican and Pope Francis insisted it said there.
That's correct, because someone leaked some of the surveys, and it revealed, for instance, in Germany, the bishops were largely content with what Pope Benedict had done. It had not produced difficulties. What kind of difficulties result in disunity? When people are going to a Mass authorized by the Pope, the hostility is beyond the legal realm of what's permitted and what's not permitted. It's a little bit of thought control, which is basically saying if you do not find in the new Mass the same spiritual depth you found in the old Mass, that you have a problem. And my answer to that is, how can you be so sure they have a problem? Maybe they have an insight. Maybe they have an intuition. Or maybe they have a good memory, because quite frankly, as Bob pointed out, the bishop in Charlotte did say that there are some New Order Masses, Novus Ordo Masses, which are very irreverent because of different elements.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how often people complain about what they experience at Mass. I mean, you have some churches, maybe not in the U.S., but in Europe, where women are giving the sermon. In other words, an unordained person is being given the sermon because the priest is sitting down and saying this should be done. No, that's disunity, because he's violating not only the law, he's also questioning the validity of the sacrament of holy orders, because people who aren't ordained are not supposed to preach at Mass. And there's a whole theology behind that. So, if you want to find disunity, take a survey of people who've been to Novus Ordo Masses, find how many clown masses, how many cowboy masses, how many football masses. I saw a Mass once where a priest was kicking a soccer ball. Another one where they're throwing a rugby ball. And you say to yourself, wait a minute. Who's the problem? The person kneeling down and saying, Domine non sum dignus, or the person, the priest who's throwing a soccer ball around, or kicking a soccer ball, excuse me.
No, I've been to Masses in Europe, Father, where they literally had a DJ station, and in the middle of Mass, the priest went over. He was working the table, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But when Bishop Martin issued his letter on this implementation of Traditionis on Friday, May 23rd, he also issued to his priests a set of talking points, okay? These were responses to concerns, is what they called them, regarding the implementation of his orders. He apparently spent a lot of time anticipating the questions that might arise. I want to go through some of these responses, okay? One of the most curious was, quote, implementation of Traditionis Custodes will cause people to withhold their giving to the church. He says this, the Bishop Martin, all people are free to give in whatever way that they choose. However, Catholics in particular are called to give in support of the church, not out of charity, but as a response to the call of the Holy Spirit to be faithful and committed members to the one body of Christ. If they choose to do that based upon a transactional model, I give when I get what I want, that is a perspective that is more modeled by our culture than by the good news proclaimed by Jesus in the Scripture. Bob, your thoughts on that response? So that the faithful are obligated to give money to the diocese regardless of how their faith is treated? Shut up and pay?
Yeah, it's a clever argument and probably clever by half, over clever by half, because look, it's simply human nature that people tend to support things. It could be missionary activities, it could be educational activities that they see making a difference in the world. I mean, I think faithful Catholics have an obligation to discern where they put their financial resources.
Right.
And simply to say, well, look, you've got to support us because we're the diocese. Well, then you've got to make some prudential judgments, because certain things may be worth supporting in your diocese. I think in every diocese there are Catholic charities and other things that are going on, schools, et cetera, that really deserve some support. But the more general question is, how are people otherwise to register their sense of what their church is doing in a diocese? I mean, you can go and try to talk with a bishop, but I mean, many of us have tried to do this, and sometimes it's fruitful and sometimes it's not. But the bishop has a responsibility on his own part, not just to be the bishop and to require people to support him, but to actually provide them with opportunities that help advance the faith that everyone is trying to advance in a very difficult set of circumstances in the modern world. So, look, I think it's a clever idea to try to manage what they know is going to be a fierce reaction, but I will be very, very surprised if it works.
Well, Father, your thoughts on the tone of these responses. I mean, you've read them. To the charge that he isn't being synodal, therefore listening to people, the bishop says, quote, listening and agreeing aren't the same thing, end quote. Couldn't one argue, Father, that this is just the kind of autocratic model that Pope Leo warned about in his early homily? How is this appropriately pastoral?
Well, I find it interesting with talking points, because what it means is either they've done research or they're very intuitive because they already know what people are going to say, which means, of course, that they've already heard this as the pastor's objections already brought forward. So, when you criticize people being transactional, well, isn't it transactional to say, by the way, no need to send in your comments. We already know what they are. Here are the answers. So that's a number one mistake. Number two, yes, you're supposed to give money. That's in canon law. That's in Catholic tradition. But, there's a reason why when we run annual campaigns in dioceses, that we have brightly colored brochures and meetings with the bishop, because it's the difference between I'll give $1 or I'll give 100. You want to give them a reason to give 100. And if you recognize that people are appreciative of what the former bishop did, but you no longer want to do it, well, you have to accept the prices that, well, wait a minute. Are the reasons I'm varying from what the previous bishop did, are they going to sell to the people who have benefited from that? They obviously aren't going to. So I don't think he wants to reconsider his position. He certainly didn't reconsider what the pastor said. So certainly lay people he's not, I think, not going to listen to. But it's a terrible mistake. And by the way, this kind of attitude that people are going to pay anyway, led bishops in the sex abuse case to not worry about how much money they might have to pay out later, because they say, well, we'll just go back to the well here. And that's when, lay people, thank God, they said, Bishop X, Bishop Y, if you're using our money to pay settlements that we don't know about, we're not happy. We're not going to provide those funds in the future.
Yeah. No, people will pay to support their faith, the spread of that faith, and the orthodoxy. But when you deter from that, they're not going to pay. They simply, and worse, they won't show up any longer, Father. And you know this is true. You see parishes, the attendance dwindling. Why? Why are these Latin Mass communities packed with young families and children? I was just in one in another city the other day. They literally had them coming out the steps. They had families standing on the steps with the door open, listening to the Mass because they couldn't all fit. That tells you something. Something is clearly happening among the young. It's a movement, and I think they're afraid of it. I think some people are a little afraid of it. And rather than engaging and talking to these people and figuring out why are you coming, what drew you here, and giving them more of that, spreading the faith, for whatever reason they've decided we're going to close the door, shut this down, and you all get out of here. That's the wrong approach. That's a fast pass to orthodoxy. And that's where I think a lot of these people are going to end up, sadly. Bob, what do you make of the timing here? A new pope has just been elected and inaugurated. Is this really a priority for any bishop at this moment to stamp out a valid part of the Mass or a version of the Mass?
Well, many people noticed that in classic public relations fashion that this announcement was made late on the Friday before Memorial Day weekend, which meant that the public reaction, it's a holiday weekend and people are off doing other things. So this alone tells you that there was some serious calculation of how to present this in public and to try to minimize what the reaction was going to be. But I say again, look, we've seen already with the different way that Pope Leo handles things, that it simply would have been, I think, respectful. I mean, unless we find out that he consulted with the Vatican and talked with Pope Leo, and he said, yeah, go right ahead with this. I think we need to wait. We're very early still in this papacy. He's on to many more immediate pressing questions like abuse and the financial crisis in the Vatican. And he's been meeting with people we see. Cardinal O'Malley has been there, some of the people on the financial side. So we know that he hasn't yet turned his mind to this sort of liturgical thing, but we see that his liturgical practice is much more traditional than we had previously under Pope Francis. So I have to think that unless he got the green light somehow, and it strikes me that kind of using this PR tactic may indicate that he didn't, but I don't know. I mean, I still think that it would have been prudent, it would have been respectful and it might have even been important if he had spoken with the Pope to say, I've gotten approval to do this. We haven't heard that. And it makes all of this seem very, very suspicious.
Father, the Catechism says that the Eucharist is the sum and summary of our faith. Our way of thinking is attuned to the Eucharist. So if people want to be more reverent, more solemn, why is that something to be stamped out or viewed with suspicion?
Well, Pope Francis was in that school of thought. And I have to say, as analyzing based on objective statements and things that were known in the public. He was very much a product of the 60s mentality, which was, thank God we finally got rid of this Latin Mass. There's another document, if you want to talk about it, where the bishop says, that nobody knows Latin, so why are we having Mass in Latin?
Right.
Well, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. Lots of people know Latin. And by the way, even if you don't know Latin, it's like, if you don't know Italian, I can't go to the opera. Of course. You appreciate the beauty, for crying out loud. St. Augustine wrote all his works in Latin. Thomas Aquinas wrote in Latin. We scholars, use that as the basis of what they do now. We have this kind of, back to the rupture, an analogy that, the effort of Vatican II was to say, no more of the past, everything starts here. The new order of ages, which is on the dollar bill. I mean, this is, American Republic was something new. Vatican II was in continuity with all the other councils because it was doing the same thing. The doctrine of the faith was being taught. So yeah, we don't need, it bothers me as a pastor of souls that anybody would be shown the door after they've been attending Mass in a beautiful way and never displaying any hostility to the doctrine of the faith or the unity of the church that I can perceive. If there was a rebellion of people rejecting the authority of the Holy See in the Diocese of Charlotte, I think we would have heard about it. I don't think it ever happened.
No. Well, the faithful who love the old Mass are also encouraged by Bishop Martin, and I love this bit, Bob, to engage in some acts of penance and charity for the healing of the church. This is like saying, as I beat you and throw you out of the house, pray for my intentions and consider how bad you've been. He also advises them to stop listening to podcasts and to have a media blackout, that they should just stay to their own thoughts. I mean, this is, somebody said mind control. Who said it? I think it was you, Father. That, this is really mind control, Bob.
Yeah, thought control. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that he's using spiritual categories for this, as almost to say that you're bordering on something like sinfulness or schism or whatever the disunity, whatever the principle is here, and that in fact what you need to do is look into your soul. Well, right. I mean, we all need to look into our souls on a daily basis for a variety of things. But I'm willing to bet that the desire to attend the Latin Mass is pretty far down on the list of sins that most people are likely to commit. And if it's up high enough, I think we're all going to hear about it. You're right. I mean, there's going to be an open clash with some group or other and the local pastor. We didn't hear about any such thing.
No. Father, will this situation, the escalation of this blackout on the traditional Latin Mass, do you think this will provoke Pope Leo to act? Should he abrogate Pope Francis's restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass?
Well, absolutely. I think, Traditionis Custodes should be withdrawn as a document and go back to what Pope Benedict did, because, quite frankly, the pastoral good of the church was being promoted, and there was no manifest disunity being experienced by the Catholic Church in any country that I know of. If the bishops of Germany were happy with Pope Benedict, because they had a lot of objections to what he did, I think we can rest secure things were okay. And just on a human level, you mentioned the number of Catholics in the diocese, how many go to Mass on Sunday. You can't find room for a couple of thousand people to attend Mass in a beautiful form. Of course you can. This is, unfortunately, a will to enforce this notion that any competition to the new Mass is going to hurt the church. And as I'm a free market economic guy, competition spurs excellence. I mean, why do we have multiple podcasts out there? Because people say, well, I like X, but guess what? Y is better. Now, I hope they say that the Royal Grande is better, because it is. But the point of the matter is, let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yes.
Let the Mass be said. And by the way, you want to talk about vocations of the priesthood? So many of them come out of either the Latin Mass community or the knowledge that, well, as need is, maybe I can say the old Mass and the new Mass. That certainly was the case under Benedict. Only good things happen when freedom of a choice is given in this matter, because this is choosing a spiritual benefit that was proven over the course of the centuries.
Yeah. And Bob, we should remember the late Pontiff, Pope Francis, had no qualms whatsoever really ending a signature piece of legislation by his immediate predecessor, by Pope Benedict.
Yeah, I have to say I'm still absolutely shocked by the way that came about, and it came about not only at like an abstract level where you can't celebrate a traditional Latin Mass in a parish within a diocese. I mean, we even saw things like, can you announce in a parish bulletin when Latin Masses are going to be held, or wherever Latin Mass is going to be held? I mean, there's really this kind of minute attempt to impose.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to call it an ideology, but there's some sense of something that has to be preserved, and if it isn't carefully somehow fenced off from criticism and the dynamics that other people have, it's fragile. I mean, it almost is a confession that something is fragile, that they're worried is about to be destroyed. So,
right.
Look, I don't think that this question is going to go away, because I think it raises again yet the things that we've been talking about for 60 plus years with Vatican II, that the church has not yet found the balance between the church prior to the council and the post-conciliar church, and there can be this fruitful coexistence with one another.
I think Benedict tried, Bob. I think he found it. I just think subsequently, this narrative was born, and we'll get to that in a moment, that I think justified the ending of the balance and the common sense balance with history, as well as with looking with eyes to the future. We should also say a draft letter came out from Bishop Martin that was leaked to a website, and it was a host of liturgical prohibitions. Now, it calls for, you referenced this earlier, Father, the striking of all Latin, even from the new Mass, which I don't think he can actually do. I think that's part of Vatican II and the Reform. He condemns the praying of the St. Michael's prayer at the end of Mass. He wants to forbid kneeling to receive communion. Father, how is any of that in keeping with the reforms of Vatican II? Is it?
No, look, it's not. If he objects to Latin being used in the Novus Ordo, then the first thing he has to do is send a letter to Pope Leo, because he just celebrated his inaugural Mass, which was both in Italian and Latin. Latin is used all over the Church as a matter of course because it's not prohibited. Latin was never prohibited. There's no prohibition of celebrating the new Mass in Latin. So to celebrate the new Mass in English with parts in Latin is perfectly legal, and it's good. Now, he makes points that people don't know Latin, therefore it shouldn't be used. That's crazy. Forgive me, Bishop, for using that harsh word, but it doesn't make any sense.
No. The Kyrie, we should end the Kyrie. Who speaks Greek, Father?
Yeah, the Kyrie eleison in Greek, have the reproaches for Good Friday. Look, to say that the health of a people depends on forgetting everything that led up to the present version of the Mass, that's just a ridiculous way of thinking. It's nonsensical. In order to, as a priest, when I was studying in the seminary, how are the rubrics? What am I supposed to do? The rubrics of the new Mass are a modification of the previous rubrics. So in any scientific study, as people know, if you want to know the origin and nature and purpose of something, you find its antecedents and its precedents, and that's what we do. So, I feel sorry for people in that diocese if they do in fact try to abolish singing a Kyrie or a Sanctus or an Agnus Dei in Latin because somehow this is harmful. That doesn't make sense.
The bigger problem here, Father, is it's not even in keeping with the general instruction of the Roman Missal. It demands certain things. The Latin is mentioned there. The people have the option to kneel or stand. That's really up to the people receiving communion. Anyway, Bob, it's being reported that Bishop Martin will not release that letter of those, prohibitions on practices even in the new Mass, mostly due to the blowback. It's being reported from his clergy, which is all the more reason why the sheep should keep their ear to the ground and keep raising their voices, I think.
Yeah, I read that draft letter, and I have to say, it takes your breath away that there can't be altar rails. If you have them, they need to be pulled out. There can't be prie-dieu. There can't be objects on the altar that block the view of the sacred elements, the bread and wine. It's like a progressive's wish list, just one thing after another. And the thing that is quite sad from my point of view, and I know other people may look at this differently, is yes, in a way, Christianity is about simplicity and the poor and the marginalized and whatnot. But it's not about dumbing down or bringing everything down to the kind of most passive element in our churches, as if we can't have anything elevated, we can't have any music, we can't have any special language. I'm always surprised when I'm at Mass and we're using Latin that a lot of the people who have never studied Latin know how to say Agnus Dei. They know the Our Father, Domine non sum dignus. They've heard it enough that they can do it, and they kind of know what it means actually. And we know that the Vatican document on the liturgy actually asks that we lift people up. Bring them up to understanding. Bring them up to be able to understand chant and appreciate chant, different forms of music, and also to have contemporary forms, but not to just move everything down to the kind of most pedestrian street level. When we need to lift up our hearts and our spirits to God.
Well, people should read the Vatican Council documents, Vatican II Council documents on the liturgy. It calls for the preservation of the Latin. It calls for polyphony and chant in the Mass. In many places you don't have any of that. So if we want to talk about continuity with the Council, if that's the new bar for everything, well, you've got to then read the document and figure it out. But it really, my heart bleeds for the people in those parishes in North Carolina, in Charlotte, as well as other places that have endured this over the last few years. It's not only there. This is just the most flagrant and recent example. The Anglican Communion, I want to switch gears here. They have not had an Archbishop of Canterbury since November of 2024, Father. The Crown Nominations Committee, that's the group that elects the next head of the Anglican Communion, they are in place now. Everybody's been selected, and they're about to elect a new Archbishop of Canterbury. What does the sluggish process tell you about the vitality of that communion? And it's being reported they could have their first female Archbishop of Canterbury.
Well, the reality is the King of England appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that is not what the Catholic Church is doing and approves of, but that's what the Anglican Communion does. So it's really up to the king how long he wants things to go or how quick he wants them to go. The sad thing, of course, is that in Christian understanding, the shepherd is supposed to stand over the sheep and lead them in salvation. So the shepherd is not supposed to be sort of like an icon of the whole community and what the community thinks is important. It's supposed to be a representative of Jesus and what he thinks is important. So hopefully they'll elect someone who is a serious Christian in the sense of believing in the Bible, the doctrine that's communicated by Christ to his apostles. But as a Catholic priest, I lament, that extraneous factors such as, well, we have to have a woman bishop, therefore we're going to get one. Well, we don't accept women bishops, so leave that aside. But what about the idea? We need to see someone who's a really good shepherd to lead the church. I hope that's what they do.
Yeah. Well, Bob, it also, an Anglican friend of mine, a cleric, reached out to me during the conclave and said, it's amazing. The world is paying all this attention to the election of a pope. We haven't had an Archbishop of Canterbury for months. Nobody's paying any attention at all. They don't even report on it. I mean, it is kind of stunning.
Yeah, and it's sad. Look, for all the differences and the conflicts we've had with the Anglicans over the years, and they've certainly killed enough Catholic priests, back at the founding of their own church. It's quite sad because the Anglican tradition, and we're all native English speakers. Yeah. I really think that the Anglican ordinariate, which was another gift that we got from Pope Benedict, is one of the beautiful additions to the liturgies of the Western Church. And when I go to some of those masses, it really strikes me that there's something beautiful about having an English language mass that has a tradition going back to Shakespeare and even earlier. Yeah. The oddness about their inability to select somebody, I think, has Father put his finger on it, has partly to do with these political considerations that they exist in our church as well, but not quite in the same way as they seem to exist in the Anglican Church. And on top of it, their previous Archbishop of Canterbury had to resign because he mishandled some sexual abuse cases, and I think that may have been a trauma that has made them think long and hard about who is going to succeed justice.
Final question. Last Sunday, the Pope publicly prayed for Chinese Catholics at the Vatican. And he said this: in the churches and shrines in China and throughout the world, prayers have been raised to God as a sign of the solicitude and affection for Chinese Catholics and their communion within the universal church. Pope Benedict instituted this feast day, Father, but with that 2018 Vatican-China deal still in play, what do you think was meant by this? Why do you think the Pope Leo underscored it?
Well, it was the Feast of Our Lady of Seshan, which is the Chinese appellation of our Blessed Virgin Mother. He has solicitude for the Chinese Catholics, there's no doubt, because he did bring it up. But in my opinion, he needs then to look at the secret Chinese agreement, and he needs to look at the appointment of bishops who are unworthy by the Communist Party to run dioceses in that country. And he needs to look, quite frankly, at just the overall persecution of the Catholic Church in China. I mean, again, we mentioned Jimmy Lai frequently in other venues. Jimmy Lai is a Catholic convert who is in prison on trumped-up charges in Hong Kong. And not once has the Holy See ever mentioned his name in dealing, in proclaiming the need for human rights throughout the world. And that was a glaring omission in the last pontificate. It would be nice if we heard that Pope Leo had sent a letter to Jimmy Lai and to others who were imprisoned. I mean, it's up to him to decide the modalities, but I'm just saying, Holy Father, speaking as someone who's followed this story, and we all have, why is it that political prisoners in other countries get the attention of the Holy See, but not a Chinese Catholic who's so faithful?
Yeah. Bob, last word, and you've written a fantastic book that has an entire chapter on this persecuted and martyred church in China.
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. I appreciate you mentioning that. Look, Pope Leo was the head of the Congregation for Bishops, so he must know very well, who the bishops are there, where they stand. We know from work by our friend Nina Shea and others that something like 10 bishops have just disappeared.
Yeah.
They're either in prison or they're dead, and they're just gone. We don't know where they are. So I agree with Father. Look, the situation is known. We have pretty good data on what's happened to people like Jimmy Lai. Even Cardinal Zen at one point was being threatened in Hong Kong.
Yep.
We have a pretty good idea of what's happening there. It would take some very, very delicate negotiations, I think, to withdraw the church from that agreement. It might bring some further harm to Catholics there. But I think we have now, we can see clearly we've made a deal with the devil. And you know what happens when you make a deal with the devil? It never turns out well.
No. Well, and we know Pope Leo is one of the only popes in recent memory who actually has visited China. When he was head of the Augustinian order, he's talked about going and visiting Augustinian homes there and meeting with clergy. So he probably has a different perspective here than any of his predecessors. Let's hope, grace and knowledge prevails upon him to involve himself in the situation of this poor community and much beleaguered Catholic faithful. Posse, we will leave it there. And if you want more of the Arroyo Grande Prayerful Posse, and who doesn't, subscribe to the Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube, Arroyo Grande Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, go wherever you get it and sign up. On behalf of Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, till the posse rides again, stay in the light. I'm Raymond Arroyo. We'll see you next time. Bye now. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and is available on the iHeart Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.